Jeffrey Engel is the founding director of the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University, an expert on the presidency and the history of modern American diplomacy. He has written 12 books on these subjects, including one titled The Fall of the Berlin Wall, The Revolutionary Legacy of 1989. And his latest book is titled Impeachment and American History. Thank you for being with us today, Jeffrey. Jeffrey, please pick up the story from there.
Well, this is where we have to remember that Germany is really at the heart of the entire Cold War. I mean, there is an ideological function, of course, between communism and capitalism that we always focus on, but the true struggle is who's going to control the resources of Central Europe. And for Nikita Khrushchev, he had a major problem in the late 1950s and 1960s as he tried to consolidate power in Germany. Germans kept leaving. As I say, in East Germany in particular, they would go into the American zone and not come back. The people were voting with their feet. Ultimately, the decision was made in Moscow to erect a wall, essentially a wall not to keep people out, but to keep people in, to keep the people from leaving, because, to be honest, the best and the brightest were the ones who most wanted to find a new life in the West. Well, the geography is really key. I mean, this is something I actually have to explain to my students, that because Germany was divided up into 4 zones at the end of World War II, 4 zones of occupation, Soviet, American, British, and French, and so too was Berlin, even after a consolidation of the British, American, and French zones, we still had that section in Berlin that was internationally controlled in the heart of the German capital, in the heart of East Germany. We're really hard pressed to find another example of a country that is willing to have another country in charge of its major capital city for decades on end. And Nikita Khrushchev, as you pointed out, tried time and again to get the Americans and their allies to leave. They were both right, but I think honestly President Reagan was less right than the foreign policy team, because we now know that the difficulties that Gorbachev were facing were primarily from conservative hardline communists who wanted to repeal back, if you will, perestroika and glasnost. The real danger in the end of the Cold War period that we're talking about, which by the way, no one at the time would have referred to it as the end of the Cold War, the real danger is not that the Soviets will be too friendly. It's not that Mikhail Gorbachev will tear down the wall. It's that he'll do something like tear down the wall and then find himself facing a coup the next week. So anything I think that was done to encourage opposition to Gorbachev, to put him on the spot, as you said, was extraordinarily dangerous. And here I think you can see a real interesting difference between the Reagan administration and the Bush administration. You know, as Secretary Baker said at the time when he came in 1989, this is not a friendly takeover. There really was a different mindset, because the Reagan administration, as a historian I would say, was fundamentally focused on the right moral path of trying to end the Soviet Union and end the Cold War, and didn't give a whole lot of thought to what happened the next day. Whereas the Bush administration was confronted immediately with the problem of, do we deal with Gorbachev, and then what happens next? And they essentially had to pick up the pieces, if you will, of the great moral clarity that Reagan offered. I mean, this is one of those things that we now know because we have all their documentation. One of the great things about having a state collapse is you get to keep all the records. And we now know that there were a series in 1983 in particular of events where Soviet policymakers heard Ronald Reagan, heard him talk about a crusade of fire, heard him talk about purging the world of communism, heard him talk about the communist state as being an evil empire, and were genuinely worried that he meant what he said. If you really took the president at his word, I mean, I know it's hard to imagine these days, but presidential words matter. If you really take the president at his word, if you're in Moscow, you're very scared. Nikita Khrushchev felt that he had the ability to put nuclear weapons into Cuba. I mean, we don't get the Cuban Missile Crisis without John Kennedy essentially doing poorly by his own admission in Vienna. By the same token, though, if we say that that you would praise Reagan for pursuing Kennedy's policy of containment, I would argue that that's exactly what you did not do in 1987, because Reagan calling out the Soviet Union to collapse, which again, great line, and by the way, something that was very aspirationally wonderful, suggests that the United States had the power to make it happen. They rumble because Gorbachev was able to stay in power. if Gorbachev had been removed by the hardliners, of course, the coup that finally occurred in August of 1991 was a coup that was predicted by the American intelligence services for President Bush the first week he was in office. And he basically got the exact same memo every week, that if you push too hard, if you try to get the only person in the world who can keep reform going, if you put him in a hot spot and give aid to his enemies, then that is going to undo everything that you might hope to do. Now, I have to say, we have to remember, the Bush administration and the Reagan administration were not entirely clear that Gorbachev himself was a true reformer. But they knew that there were a lot of people who were much worse waiting to get in line after him.